There's been a lot of discussion recently about dispensing errors. Firstly, in relation to manslaughter prosecutions, there was the case of Honey Rose, an optometrist a couple of years ago who was prosecuted for manslaughter when she failed to spot an eye defect in a young child. And more recently, Dr. Bauer-Garber, who was prosecuted again for manslaughter because it was alleged that she failed to identify that one of her patients, a young child, was suffering from sepsis. And those two prosecutions, in particular the Bauer-Garber case, has led Jeremy Hunt to announce a review of the criminalisation in terms of manslaughter of healthcare professionals. The review is only just in its early stages, and it's difficult to imagine really the circumstances in which there could be some sort of decriminalisation of dispensing errors in respect of manslaughter investigations because of the way the legislation is set up. But we of course do wait to see how that pans out. I add that no pharmacist has ever been convicted of manslaughter, although a couple have been tried over the years. One 150 years ago and one about 10 or so years ago, although both were acquitted. The reason I suspect that pharmacists aren't convicted of manslaughter offences is not because they don't make the errors which lead to deaths, because we know sadly that does occur sometimes, but more because of the judicial guidance in relation to manslaughter, which requires that the pharmacist's conduct would have to be truly and exceptionally bad, not just merely negligent. And of course most dispensing errors will, I suspect, be classified as negligent, but not truly and exceptionally bad, and therefore not criminally negligent. So no pharmacists convicted, but the threat remains and will remain unless and until the Department of Health does something following the Jeremy Hunt review. At the same time, of course, we have the decriminalisation of dispensing errors coming into force probably in April. Currently, pharmacists who supply the wrong medicine to a patient are guilty of an offence under the Medicines Act. That's caused a lot of uproar, of course, over the years, particularly following Elizabeth Lee in 2007. And then there have been 2 or 3 pharmacists since then, most recently Martin White in Northern Ireland, who were convicted of that offence and in fact received a suspended prison sentence for the dispensing error. And since 2007 there have been calls for decriminalisation of the error by pharmacists, but the government, Department of Health, has had the same problem in relation to decriminalisation of dispensing errors as I think Mr Hunt will find in relation to decriminalisation of manslaughter. And that is that you don't want to remove the offence itself. That offence, in the government's view, still performs a useful task. So the only way of removing the threat of prosecution from pharmacists if they make a dispensing error is to introduce a statutory defence. And that's taken very many years. But hopefully we're at the end of that road now. The statutory defence will hopefully come into force, as I say, in April. The difficulty is, though, that statutory defence is complex of itself. The pharmacist will have to jump over at least 4, if not more, hurdles in order to fall within the defence. And that's going to continue to create a lot of uncertainty for pharmacists who make an error, because you won't know, as a pharmacist, whether you're going to be convicted of that error until you get the verdict from the jury at the end of a trial, because it'll be for the jury to decide whether the pharmacist's conduct falls within each part of the statutory defence. So pharmacists certainly shouldn't assume that they're off the hook now in terms of dispensing errors if they're made in the pharmacy. There is still a significant risk, in my view, that a pharmacist who makes a dispensing error will find themselves at least being investigated for a crime, even if they are not ultimately prosecuted and convicted. So this is definitely not the time for pharmacists to drop their guard in relation to practice.